gentlemen, and welcome back to SF Live. I'm your host, Myrna Lim. Tonight we have a very special guest, a very prominent San Francisco criminal defense attorney who has been practicing for over 25 years. He has tried over 250 cases, homicide cases, trafficking cases, drug cases, and so on and so forth. And the question is, why did we invite this gentleman here tonight? Well, guess what? In this coming November election, that is, there are three significant, life-changing measures in the ballot. We have one, the repeal of the death penalty, as I'm sure all of you guys are aware. There's also the amendment to the three strikes rule. We'll talk about that. I don't know if you remember some time ago when there was this huge passion, this huge upheaval regarding how the criminal elements are being treated in our society today. And then lastly, we also have another measure in the ballot which covers human trafficking. So altogether, we have propositions 34, 36, and 35. And that's why we can't do better than have one of the most prominent, most respected criminal defense attorneys, Joe O'Sullivan, with us tonight. Hi, Joe. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's talk about, death penalty. You have tried death penalty cases.
I've done 5 death penalty cases, and fortunately nobody has suffered death.
Okay, and we have, and that is Proposition 34. Now, could you tell us about what this proposition will do, and then also talk about some of the concerns that other people would have? It's like, what would happen to the criminals who are so heinous and so evil? What are you going to do with them? So anyway, let's talk about.
In California, it's very rare for anyone to receive death.
Right.
There are many people that death has been imposed on, but by the time it goes through habeas petitions,
right,
federal petitions, federal court, it's very unlikely that anyone will ever get the death penalty in California.
Right.
And I think recently it was in Illinois when the governor realized how flawed the system was that he just unilaterally abolished the death penalty.
Right.
And I think here we're trying to do it through the electorate.
Right.
But I think most people are concerned with the absurd cost that's
right,
involved in a death penalty case.
Right.
The length of it and the financial amount is an absurdity. And if you compare that to life without possibility of parole,
right,
and that is exactly what it means, the person convicted would never get out.
right,
I think society is much better served financially, legally, and there's closure.
right,
And I think that that's just the way things should be.
right. So here are the stats. Basically, since the current death penalty was enacted in California in 1978, around 900 individuals have received the death sentence. Of these, 14, as you say, only 14 have been executed. 83 have died prior to them being executed. And as of July 12, we have 725 offenders in state prison. So the gist of the proposal to repeal the death penalty seems to be more from a fiscal standpoint, it looks like.
I think it is. Fiscally, it's an absurd amount of money that is
right,
spent on each and every death penalty case.
Right. Well, could you talk about, you mentioned about all this appeal process, the petitions, the habeas and so forth. Could you talk about just general process in terms of what happens if somebody like the guy who killed Polyclass, we'll talk about the 3 strikes, he got the death penalty, that guy.
Well, if you...
Davis?
Was it Ronald Davis? I'm not sure.
Yeah, he's...
I think he ended up pleading.
Oh, he did?
I believe so.
Oh, okay, all right.
But anyway, if you get a death penalty case,
right,
most of the defendants would be what's called indigent.
Right.
That means they can't pay. Maybe the family can pay for their lawyer, but they can't pay for all the ancillary services
right,
that are necessary. So you start out by getting an unlimited amount of money from the state.
Right.
It's called 987 funds.
Right.
And you can have every conceivable expert that you want. And even
Wow.
if someone does not really seem to be appropriate, the defense attorney is going to get it and pay for it and utilize
Right.
it to protect themselves from not being accused of mishandling the case.
Right.
And then it will go on to the appeals if there's a conviction. It will go all through the state court, the appellate system,
Right.
the California Supreme Court,
Right.
and then they'll start all over again with habeas petitions in the federal courts claiming a violation of constitutional
right.
rights. So I would think that it's probably on every death penalty case that there's a conviction. If it is exhausted through all of the appellate process, it's probably $10 million
For one person?
for one person. It's crazy.
Wow. 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 That is incredible.
And you're comparing that against life without possibility of parole,
Right.
which means that, and the person would never get out.
Exactly. So then, these proposition talks about how much money they're going, the state will save. They're looking at about $100 million.
Right. They have special housing.
Right.
They're treated uniquely.
Right. Right. Well, okay. Then, how could the state then distinguish these people? These because they're gonna go through resentencing, right?
Where they'd all be sentenced to a lesser sentence of the life without possibility of parole. It's called LWOP.
Right. Okay. But how are you gonna then treat these people? Would you treat these people any differently from the people who have had life sentences?
No, they'd be assimilated into the normal population.
Okay.
Whenever somebody is charged with a death penalty case,
Right.
the two potential punishments are life without possibility of parole or death.
Right.
And the existing people who have death sentences would be assimilated into the normal population.
Right.
And then it would not be an option in the future if someone's charged with homicide.
Right.
It would be special circumstances, but the only circumstance would be life without possibility of parole.
Okay. Great. Okay. Now let's move on to the next topic. The state has loaded the ballots with this. These are critical issues.
A lot of criminal issues, yes.
Exactly. I mean, this is no joke. Okay, the next one is 3 strikes. Okay, could you tell? This is a lot confusing, very confusing to a lot of people. I remember the time when that kid poly class. I mean, that's just a parent's nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when that happened, to find out that this guy, Ronald Davis, is like a monster. He cannot be rehabilitated. You can do anything. This guy kidnapped this kid from her own house at a party, raped her, killed her, and buried her. And it turned out that this guy has committed such crimes like forever. I mean, this is evil. This is pure evil. See how passionate I get about that.
I don't disagree, but I think
Okay, but so now there's this problem. I think is what is going to be corrected with the 3 strikes. That 3 strikes are not for people like this guy Ronald Davis.
it's not implemented. It's
Right.
implemented with people that steal a loaf of bread
Exactly.
and get 3 strikes.
Okay, so could you explain how people get 3 strikes right now?
Sure. If you get arrested for any felony, all felonies in California carry a sentence, a low, middle, or an aggregate sentence.
Okay.
So if you were convicted or you pled, you would get one of those sentences.
Right.
If you have prior convictions, if you have a prior conviction for a serious or a violent felony,
Right.
that constitutes a strike.
Right.
If you have 1 prior strike and you're facing a new sentence, that means the new sentence can be doubled.
Right.
If you have 2 priors, either violent or serious, and you get a new felony, that means you're facing 25 years to life.
Right.
The example that most people use is if you're arrested for possession of stolen property, meaning you have something that you didn't steal but someone else stole.
Right.
It's a crime. And generally you get about 2 years for that. If you have 2 priors, then you can get 25 years to life. And the problem with the 3 strikes is that the new offense does not have to be serious or violent. It can be stealing a loaf of bread. It could be having narcotics.
Right.
It could be anything. So there's no correlation with the priors, which are required
Right.
to be serious or violent. The new offense does not have to be either.
Okay. Now that That makes sense. That makes sense. Now, the only question that I have when I was looking at the proposition that was written, prepared by the Attorney General's office, is there's this provision that these 3 strikes will continue to be imposed. Okay, it says it continues to impose life sentence penalty if third strike conviction was for certain non-serious, non-violent sex or drug offenses or involved firearm possession. Well, okay, people get busted for carrying marijuana all the time. Does
Right.
that fall into
No,
that?
that wouldn't fall into
Okay.
it. And just as an aside,
Right,
3 strikes is obviously draconian sentencing.
right,
But in California, you get, as I said, 3 potential sentences for any crime, but you get enhancements for weapons.
right,
If you use a weapon, you can get 10, 20, or 30 years.
right,
Attempted murder now is a life sentence.
right,
Great bodily injury has serious ramifications.
right.
The sentencing scheme in California is extremely serious.
Okay,
We really don't need 3 strikes. And the polyclass individual that you described as a monster, I agree, but I don't think he's representative of most of these criminals.
right,
But he would have gotten just as serious a sentence just for the crimes he committed. The
Right.
sexual assault on the young lady and the kidnapping are life.
right.
We have ample sentences, and we're just building more and more prisons. It's
Well-
ludicrous.
Okay, but I guess the question is, how did he get out? Why was he out to commit? He obviously had done 2 major felonies
Right,
before
but-
that.
You don't know. You'd have to go back to the underpinnings of those crimes
Right.
to see if there were problems in proof
Right.
or problems in the
He
plea
didn't have a very
bargain.
good lawyer like you.
I don't do those type of
That's
cases.
right. That's kind of ooh.
But you'd have to go. He's not representative. Most people like him under California's sentencing structure would be in prison forever.
Right.
I represent a lot of people accused of being involved in gangs and shootings, and the potential sentences that they face are just astronomical.
Right.
Huge sentences in California. It's not an easy state to commit a crime and to be charged.
Okay. Now let's talk about. I'm sure a lot of people would want to know some of your current cases, but let's keep that for last. There's another proposition. Okay. Oops. All right. This is about human trafficking penalties. Proposition 35. It increases criminal penalties for human trafficking, including prison sentences up to 15 years to life and fines up to 1.5 million. Why is this necessary? What do you think this is about?
I think it's a political hot button issue.
Oh, really?
And I think they're trying to emulate the federal statutes.
Oh, okay. Well, what is it now? And then what is the...
Well, if you're committing, if it's most of the sex acts are committed by females,
Right.
if you're a prostitute or you're working in as a masseuse or something like
Yeah.
that, the penalties are very minor.
Right.
Probation, things like that. If they can actually show that there is a pimp involved, then it becomes much more serious. But I think that it's hard to show on a state level that there's human trafficking. Human trafficking would be somebody coming from another country
Right.
where the feds would be involved and they would handle it. But if people voluntarily work at one massage parlor and go across the city to another one, that would constitute human trafficking. That's absurd.
Okay, but okay, there's 2 things that's going on. One of which is that in most people's minds, and I think when people listen to this, it's human trafficking. When we watch television, we look at the internet, and in the average person's mind, human trafficking is just like what you said. They transport people from one country to the next or from one state to the next and engage them in prostitution or some type of crimes, and mostly they're minors, and or people who are forced into labor, like people from Mexico who are being transported, or from China being transported in the country to be involved in forced labor. So in people's minds, that's what human trafficking is. Now we're saying that this is not exactly that. I mean, you don't need to transport or to transfer across state lines for it to be human trafficking?
No, the state lines is limited to federal jurisdiction.
Well, this is a strange one then.
Right. I just think that it's a politically correct cause. I think for the people that espouse the interests of these young girls, that's great. But I think most of them are in there voluntarily,
Right.
if not voluntarily, because of drugs and things like that.
Well-
If they actually have a pimp, then go after the bad guy.
Well, I mean, there was one time, if we're talking politics, wasn't there like an initiative, I don't know if it's only in San Francisco, I get confused with San Francisco and the rest of the country, where there was a move to decriminalize prostitution.
Right.
So is this kind of,
At odds with that?
yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Well,
It's just unnecessary.
well, but would it create more legal problems though for lawyers like you? I mean, how are you going to argue that in court when you're saying, well, if somebody says, charge a client of yours with human trafficking with huge fines, 1.5 million after 15 years for life, and then how do you define human sex trafficking here? Well, wait a second. It says, well, under federal law and state law, does this require that somebody has to be transported though? Is that the element that has to be met? If they're from San Francisco, they're local prostitutes or local working girls, could they be charged? And there's a John involved. Could there be that charge of human trafficking?
They would have to show, legally there's a word called asportation.
Right.
It's used in kidnapping. It means the
Okay,
movement.
they have to be moved.
There'd have to
Okay.
be some sort of movement.
All right.
I could see where they could potentially have a case if there was
Across state lines?
many young, say Asian
Would it have to
girls
be
who did not
across?
speak English and would have no reason for being here. But I just
Would it
think,
have to be across state lines though? Is that a requirement to prove the element?
no, that couldn't be a crime. That couldn't be an element of a state crime. That would have to still be federal.
Okay, but for this particular statute that they're proposing,
I think that particular article is poorly drafted.
Yeah, it's
I don't
flawed,
think it
right?
would stand scrutiny, not at all.
yeah, because I don't see anything here.
Right.
I
It's just
mean,
trying to imitate and it's trying to make the penalties more serious and the punishments costlier. But I really don't think it's applicable to this state of California.
Huh. Well,
Because if the things that they claim would be true, the feds still have jurisdiction in California for
Right,
violation of a
exactly.
federal crime.
yeah. But then, it would still be the federal statute that would
Preempt.
preempt
Yes.
the state law.
That's correct.
But then the fines under the state law are quite that. I don't remember the federal statute having 1.5 million 15 years. Is that
Well, most federal crimes have huge
fines?
fines that are never imposed.
Oh, all right. Huh, okay. Well, those are major considerations, isn't it? I mean, how many people actually read this stuff, you know?
Probably very few.
Okay, now let's talk about you. Let's talk about your cases. Our technician was just here and we were talking about your saggy pants case. That's kind of an interesting, esoteric case for...
That was Deshaun Marmon,
Yeah, I mean, you going into talking about the First Amendment there, huh?
right? He's a young African-American, great
Football
kid,
player. Okay.
star football player from San Francisco. And his best friend at City College was murdered
Wow.
in Betrayal Hill. And he came out to go to the funeral, to express his regrets.
Right.
And he was on a hurried schedule back to New Mexico where he had a football scholarship from City College. And he was
Wow.
carrying a bag on both arms, very heavy, and his pants were sagging, as is a normal thing for some young African American kids.
Yeah, and you
And he
can see
went
the
through
boxer
3
shorts.
items of security, 3 checks. He had bought his ticket. He and his mom were there, paid cash, was about to board the plane when a person told him that he was dressed improperly. And the allegation that it was improper was that 3 inches of his underwear was showing. None of his buttocks was showing, nothing. He sat down on the plane. The captain came up to him, told me he had to go. He was going to remove him. And he told the captain, no, I'm just like everyone else. And fortunately, the passenger sitting next to him videotaped everything. And the plane captain leaned in and said, "No, you're not like everyone else."
Wow.
And we thought this meant that he was not a middle, typical white American. He was a young African American with dreads.
Terrible.
And so then they asked him to step outside. When he stepped into the causeway, he was jumped by 10 or 15 police officers, arrested.
As though they don't
pummeled.
have anything to do, huh?
Yeah.
This
And
is in
then
San Francisco?
It was in San Francisco International Airport, but the jurisdiction is San Mateo County.
Oh, San Mateo County,
And then
yeah.
I met
They have a
with
reputation.
the attorneys, district attorneys in San Mateo County. They agreed that a prosecution would be inappropriate.
Yeah.
So all charges were dismissed against him.
Oh, good. And then what happens now? Does he have any
There's a
remedy?
civil suit pending
Ah.
against U.S. Air,
Is that a 42 USC 1983 or
1983.
discrimination?
Ironically, there was a photograph sent to me by a frequent flyer for U.S. Air showing a middle-aged white man dressed in a bra, underpants, and fishnet
And that was okay.
stockings who flies regularly on U.S. Air.
And that's okay.
And it's okay. And he is a frequent flyer and has a card. And U.S. Air said they had no policy against attire.
Oh my God, that's horrible. Anyway, and you were the regional defense counsel for Ramos, the one who killed the Bologna kids.
Yes,
Okay.
I did, and I represent Ramos's. I represent him for a while.
Yeah.
Then I had to conflict out because I represent the other alleged shooter, Flacco. I represent
Yeah.
his wife,
Wow.
so I had a conflict.
Wow. That's that's I live in that district, and so when that case was happening, when that killing was happening, I was like 3 blocks away.
Wow.
Yeah, I could have been in the wrong place at the wrong
I
time.
had a lot of threats on my phone
Oh,
from
Jesus.
friends of the Bologna
Well,
family.
ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Good night.